An Upheaval. By Anton Chekhov. Mashenka Pavletsky, a young girl who had just finished her studies at a boarding school, returning from a walk to the house of the Pushkins, with whom she was living as a governess, found the household in a terrible turmoil. Mihailo, the porter who opened the door to her, was excited and red as a crab. Loud voices were heard from upstairs.
Madame Pushkin is in a fit, most likely, or else she has quarreled with her husband,
thought Mashenka. In the hall and in the corridor, she met maidservants. One of them was crying. Then Mashenka saw, running out of her room, the master of the house himself, Nikolai Sergeyevich, a little man with a flabby face and a bald head, though he was not old. He was red in the face and twitching all over. He passed the governess without noticing her, and throwing up his arms, exclaimed,
"Oh, how horrible it is! How tactless, how stupid, how barbarous, abominable!"
Mashenka went into her room, and then for the first time in her life it was her lot to experience in all its acuteness the feeling that is so familiar to persons in dependent positions, who eat the bread of the rich and powerful, and cannot speak their minds. There was a search going on in her room. The lady of the house, Fedosia Vasilyevna, a stout, broad-shouldered, uncouth woman, with thick black eyebrows, a faintly perceptible moustache, and red hands, who was exactly like a plain, illiterate cook in face and manners, was standing, without her cap on, at the table, putting back into Mashenka's work-bag balls of wool, scraps of materials, and bits of papers. Evidently the governess's arrival took her by surprise, since, on looking round and seeing the girl's pale and astonished face, she was a little taken aback, and muttered,
"Pardon, I upset it accidentally. My sleeve caught in it."
Then, saying something more, Madame Pushkin rustled her long skirts and went out. Mashenka looked round the room with wondering eyes, and, unable to understand it, not knowing what to think, shrugged her shoulders and turned cold with dismay. What had Fedosia Vasilyevna been looking for in her work-bag? If she really had, as she said, caught her sleeve in it and upset everything, why had Nikolai Sergeyevich dashed out of her room so excited and red in the face? Why was one drawer of the table pulled out a little way? The money-box, in which the governess put away 10-kopeck pieces and old stamps, was open. They had opened it, but did not know how to shut it, though they had scratched the lock all over. The whatnot with her books on it, the things on the table, the bed, all bore fresh traces of a search. Her linen basket, too. The linen had been carefully folded, but it was not in the same order as Mashenka had left it when she went out. So the search had been thorough, most thorough. But what was it for? Why? What had happened? Mashenka remembered the excited porter, the general turmoil which was still going on, the weeping servant girl, Had it not all some connection with the search that had just been made in her room? Was she not mixed up in something dreadful? Mashenka turned pale, and feeling cold all over, sank onto her linen basket. A maidservant came into the room.
Liza, you don't know why they've been rummaging in my room?
The governess asked her.
Mistress has lost a brooch worth 2,000,
said Liza.
Yes, but why have they been rummaging in my room? They've been searching every one, miss. They've searched all my things, too. They stripped us all naked and searched us. God knows, miss, I never went near her toilet table, let alone touching the brooch. I shall say the same at the police station. But why have they been rummaging here?
The governess still wondered.
A brooch has been stolen, I tell you. The mistress has been rummaging in everything with her own hands. She even searched Mihalo, the porter, herself. It's a perfect disgrace. Nikolai Sergeyich simply looks on and cackles like a hen. But you've no need to tremble like that, miss. They found nothing here. You've nothing to be afraid of if you didn't take the brooch. But, Liza, it's vile. It's insulting,
said Mashenka, breathless with indignation.
It's so mean, so low. What right had she to suspect me and to rummage in my things? You're living with strangers, miss,
sighed Liza.
Though you are a young lady, still you are, as it were, a servant. It's not like living with your mamma and papa.
Mashenka threw herself on the bed and sobbed bitterly. Never in her life had she been subjected to such an outrage. Never had she been so deeply insulted. She, well-educated, refined, the daughter of a teacher, was suspected of theft. She had been searched like a streetwalker. She could not imagine a greater insult, and to this feeling of resentment was added an oppressive dread of what would come next. All sorts of absurd ideas came into her mind. If they could suspect her of theft, then they might arrest her, strip her naked, and search her, then lead her through the street with an escort of soldiers, cast her into a cold, dark cell with mice and woodlice, exactly like the dungeon in which Princess Tarakanov was imprisoned. Who would stand up for her? Her parents lived far away in the provinces. They had not the money to come to her. In the capital she was as solitary as in a desert, without friends or kindred. They could do what they liked with her.
I will go to all the courts and all the lawyers,
Mashenka thought, trembling.
I will explain to them. I will take an oath. They will believe that I could not be a thief.
Mashenka remembered that under the sheets in her basket she had some sweetmeats, which, following the habits of her school days, she had put in her pocket at dinner and carried off to her room. She felt hot all over and was ashamed at the thought that her little secret was known to the lady of the house. All this terror, shame, resentment brought on an attack of heart palpitation which set up a throbbing in her temples, in her heart, and deep down in her stomach.
"Dinner is ready,"
the servant summoned Mashenka.
Shall I go or not?
Mashenka brushed her hair, wiped her face with a wet towel, and went into the dining room. There they had already begun dinner. At one end of the table sat Fedosia Vassilyevna with a stupid, solemn, serious face. At the other end, Nikolai Sergeyich. At the sides there were the visitors and the children. The dishes were handed by 2 footmen in swallow-tails and white gloves. Everyone knew that there was an upset in the house, but Madame Kushkin was troubled, and everyone was silent. Nothing was heard but the sound of munching and the rattle of spoons on the plates. The lady of the house herself was the first to speak.
"What is the 3rd course?"
she asked the footman in a weary, injured voice.
"Estoujon à la Russe,"
answered the footman.
"I ordered that, Fenya,"
Nikolai Sergeyevich hastened to observe.
"I wanted some fish. If you don't like it, monsieur, don't let them serve it. I just ordered it."
Fedosya Vassilyevna did not like dishes that she had not ordered herself, and now her eyes filled with tears.
Come, don't let us agitate ourselves,"
Mamakov, her household doctor, observed in a honeyed voice, just touching her arm, with a smile just as honeyed.
"We are nervous enough as it is. Let us forget the brooch. Health is worth more than 2,000 rubles.
"It's not the 2,000 I regret,"
answered the lady, and a big tear rolled down her cheek.
"It's the fact itself that revolts me. I cannot put up with thieves in my house. I don't regret it. I regret nothing. But to steal from me is such ingratitude. That's how they repay me for my kindness."
They all looked into their plates. But Mashenka fancied after the lady's words that everyone was looking at her. A lump rose in her throat. She began crying and put her handkerchief to her lips.
"Pardon,"
she muttered.
"I can't help it. My head aches. I'll go away."
And she got up from the table, scraping her chair awkwardly, and went out quickly, still more overcome with confusion.
"It's beyond everything,"
said Nikolai Sergeyevich, frowning.
"What need was there to search her room? How out of place it was."
"I don't say she took the brooch,"
said Fedosya Vassilyevna.
"but can you answer for her? To tell the truth, I haven't much confidence in these learned paupers."
"It really was unsuitable, Fenya. Excuse me, Fenya, but you've no kind of legal right to make a search."
"I know nothing about your laws. All I know is that I've lost my brooch, and I will find the brooch."
She brought her fork down on the plate with a clatter, and her eyes flashed angrily.
"And you eat your dinner, and don't interfere in what doesn't concern you."
Nikolai Sergeyevich dropped his eyes mildly and sighed. Meanwhile, Mashenka, reaching her room, flung herself on her bed. She felt now neither alarm nor shame, but she felt an intense longing to go and slap the cheeks of this hard, arrogant, dull-witted, prosperous woman. Lying on her bed, she breathed into her pillow and dreamed of how nice it would be to go and buy the most expensive brooch and fling it into the face of this bullying woman. If only it were God's will that Fedosya Vassilyevna should come to ruin and wander about begging, and should taste all the horrors of poverty and dependence, and that Mashenka, whom she had insulted, might give her alms. Oh, if only she could come in for a big fortune, could buy a carriage, and could drive noisily past the windows so as to be envied by that woman. But all these were only dreams. In reality, there was only one thing left to do: to get away as quickly as possible, not to stay another hour in this place. It was true, it was terrible to lose her place, to go back to her parents who had nothing. But what could she do? Mashenka could not bear the sight of the lady of the house, nor of her little room. She felt stifled and wretched here. She was so disgusted with Fedosia Vasilyevna, who was so obsessed by her illnesses and her supposed aristocratic rank, that everything in the world seemed to have become coarse and unattractive because this woman was living in it. Mashenka jumped up from the bed and began packing.
"May I come in?"
asked Nikolai Sergeyitch at the door. He had come up noiselessly to the door and spoke in a soft, subdued voice.
"May I?"
Come in.
He came in and stood still near the door. His eyes looked dim, and his red little nose was shiny. After dinner he used to drink beer, and the fact was perceptible in his walk, in his feeble, flabby hands.
"What's this?"
he asked, pointing to the basket.
I am packing. Forgive me, Nikolai Sergeyitch, but I cannot remain in your house. I feel deeply insulted by this search.
"I understand. Only, you're wrong to go. Why should you? They've searched your things, but you... What does it matter to you? You will be none the worse for it."
Mashenka was silent and went on packing. Nikolai Sergeyitch pinched his moustache as though wondering what he should say next, and went on in an ingratiating voice.
"I understand, of course, but you must make allowances. You know my wife is nervous, headstrong. You mustn't judge her too harshly."
Mashenka did not speak.
"If you are so offended,"
Nikolai Sergeyitch went on,
"well, if you like, I'm ready to apologize. I ask your pardon."
Mashenka made no answer, but only bent lower over her box. This exhausted, irresolute man was of absolutely no significance in the household. He stood in the pitiful position of a dependent and hanger-on, even with the servants, and his apology meant nothing either.
You say nothing. That's not enough for you. In that case, I will apologize for my wife, in my wife's name. She behaved tactlessly. I admit it as a gentleman."
Nikolai Sergeyitch walked about the room, heaved a sigh, and went on.
"Then you want me to have it rankling here under my heart. You want my conscience to torment me."
I know it's not your fault, Nikolai Sergeyitch,
said Mashenka, looking him full in the face with her big tear-stained eyes.
Why should you worry yourself?
"Of course, no. But still, don't you... go away. I entreat you."
Mashenka shook her head. Nikolai Sergeyitch stopped at the window and drummed on a pane with his fingertips.
"Such misunderstandings are simply torture to me," he said. "Why, do you want me to go down on my knees to you, or what? Your pride is wounded, and here you've been crying and packing up to go. But I have pride too, and you do not spare it. Or do you want me to tell you what I would not tell at confession? Do you? Listen, you want me to tell you what I won't tell the priest on my deathbed?"
Mashenka made no answer.
"I took my wife's brooch,"
Nikolai Sergeyitch said quickly.
"Is that enough now? Are you satisfied? Yes, I took it. But, of course, I count on your discretion. For God's sake, Not a word. Not half a hint to anyone.
Mashenka, amazed and frightened, went on packing. She snatched her things, crumpled them up, and thrust them anyhow into the box and the basket. Now, after this candid avowal on the part of Nikolai Sergeyevich, she could not remain another minute, and could not understand how she could have gone on living in the house before.
And that it's nothing to wonder at,
Nikolai Sergeyevich went on after a pause.
It's an everyday story. I need money, and she won't give it to me. It was my father's money that bought this house and everything, you know. It's all mine, and the brooch belonged to my mother, and it's all mine. And she took possession of everything. I can't go to law with her, you'll admit. I beg you most earnestly, overlook it. Stay on. You understand? You forgive? Will you stay?
No,
said Mashenka resolutely, beginning to tremble.
let me alone, I entreat you.
Well, God bless you,
sighed Nikolai Sergeyevich, sitting down on the stool near the box.
I must own I like people who still can feel resentment, contempt, and so on. I could sit here forever and look at your indignant face. So, you won't stay then? I understand. It's bound to be so. Yes, of course.
It's all right for you, but for me, whew, I can't stir a step out of this cellar. I'd go off to one of our estates, but in every one of them there are some of my wife's rascals, stewards, experts, damn them all. They mortgage and remortgage. You mustn't catch fish, must keep off the grass, mustn't break the trees.
Nikolai Sergeyevich,
his wife's voice called from the drawing room.
Agnia, call your master.
Then you won't stay? Asked Nikolai Sergeyevich, getting up quickly and going toward the door.
You might as well stay, really. In the evenings, I could come and have a talk with you. Eh? Stay. If you go, there won't be a human face left in the house. It's awful.
Nikolai Sergeyevich's pale, exhausted face besought her. But Mashenka shook her head, and with a wave of his hand, he went out. Half an hour later, she was on her way. Thank you for listening to this audio connoisseur production. We are dedicated to bringing the world's finest literature to an audience of discriminating listeners. We value every single listener.
This audio program is presented by Audible.com. Audible. Audio that speaks to you wherever you are.
Alistair McGowan reads the Russian master's tale called Ivan Matveyitch.
Between 5 and 6 in the evening, a fairly well-known man of learning, we'll call him simply the man of learning, is sitting in his study, nervously biting his nails. "It's positively revolting," he says, continually looking at his watch. It shows the utmost disrespect for another man's time and work. And feeling a craving to vent his wrath and impatience upon someone, the man of learning goes to the door leading to his wife's room and knocks. Listen, Katya, if you see Pyotr Danilitch, tell him that decent people don't do such things. It's abominable. He recommends a secretary and does not know the sort of man he is recommending. The wretched boy is 2 or 3 hours late with unfailing regularity every day. Do you call that a secretary? Those 2 or 3 hours are more precious to me than 2 or 3 years to other people. But when he does come, I will swear at him like a dog and won't pay him, and will kick him out. It's no use standing on ceremony with people like that. You say that every day, and yet he goes on coming and coming. But today I have made up my mind. I have lost enough through him. You must excuse me, but I shall swear at him like a cabman. At last, a ring is heard. The man of learning makes a grave face. Drawing himself up and throwing back his head, he goes into the entry. There, his secretary, Ivan Matveyitch, a young man of 18, with a face oval as an egg and no moustache, wearing a shabby, mangy overcoat and no galoshes, is already standing by the hat-stand. He is in breathless haste, and scrupulously wipes his huge, clumsy boots on the doormat, trying as he does so to conceal from the maidservant a hole in his boot, through which a white sock is peeping. Seeing the man of learning, he smiles with that broad, prolonged, somewhat foolish smile, which is seen only on the faces of children or very good-natured people. "Ah, good evening," he says, holding out a big wet hand. "Has your sore throat gone?" "Ivan Matveyitch," says the man of learning, stepping back and clasping his hands together. "Ivan Matveyitch." Then he dashes to the secretary, clutches him by the shoulders, and begins feebly shaking him. "What a way to treat me! You dreadful, horrid fellow, what a way to treat me! Are you laughing at me? Are you jeering at me? Judging from the smile, which still lingered on his face, Ivan Matveyitch had expected a very different reception, and so, seeing the man of learning's face eloquent of indignation, his oval face grows longer than ever, and he opens his mouth in amazement. What is it?" "And you ask that?" The man of learning clasps his hands. "You know how precious time is to me, and you are so late. You are 2 hours late. Have you no fear of God?" "Well, I haven't come straight from home," mutters Ivan Matveyitch, untying his scarf irresolutely. "I've been at my aunt's name-day party, and my aunt lives 5 miles away. If I had come straight from home, then, well, it would have been a different thing." "Come, reflect, Ivan Matveyitch. Is there any logic in your conduct? Here you have work to do, work at a fixed time, and you go flying off after name-day parties and aunts. Oh, but do make haste and undo your wretched scarf. It's beyond endurance, really." The man of learning dashes up to the secretary again and helps him to disentangle his scarf. "You're done up like a peasant woman. Come along, please make haste." Blowing his nose in a dirty, crumpled-up handkerchief and pulling down his grey reefer jacket, Ivan Matveyitch goes through the hall and the drawing-room to the study. There a place and paper and even cigarettes had been put ready for him long ago. Sit down," the man of learning urges him on, rubbing his hands impatiently. "You are an insufferable person. You know the work has to be finished by a certain time, and then you are so late. One is forced to scold you. Come, right, where did we stop?" Ivan Matveyitch smooths his bristling, cropped hair and takes up his pen. The man of learning walks up and down the room, concentrates himself, and begins to dictate. "The fact is, that, so to speak, fundamental forms..." Have you written it? Forms are conditioned entirely by the essential nature of those principles, comma, which find in them their expression and can only be embodied in them. New line. There's a stop there, of course. More independence is found by the forms which have not so much a political, comma, as a social character. The high school boys have a different uniform now. A grey one, said Ivan Matveyitch. When I was at school, it was better. They used to wear regular uniforms. Oh, dear, right, please, says the man of learning. Character. Have you written it? Speaking of the forms relating to the organisation, what did you want to say about the high school? That they used to wear a different uniform. In my time. Indeed. Is it long since you left the high school? But I told you that yesterday. It's 3 years since I left school. I left in the 4th class. Then why did you give up the high school? Asks the man of learning, looking at Ivan Matveyitch's writing. Oh, through family circumstances. Must I speak to you again, Ivan Matveyitch? When will you get over your habit of dragging out the lines? There ought not to be less than 40 letters in a line. What? Do you suppose I do it on purpose? Says Ivan Matveyitch. There are more than 40 letters in some of the other lines. You count them. And if you think I don't put enough in the line, you can take something off my pay. Oh, that's not the point. You have no delicacy, really. At the least thing, you drag in money. The great thing is to be exact, Ivan Matveyitch. To be exact is the great thing. You ought to train yourself to be exact. The maidservant brings in a tray with 2 glasses of tea on it and a basket of rusks. Ivan Matveyitch takes his glass awkwardly with both hands and at once begins drinking it. The tea is too hot. To avoid burning his mouth, Ivan Matveyitch tries to take a tiny sip. He eats 1 rusk, then a second, then a third. And looking sideways, with embarrassment, at the man of learning, timidly stretches after a 4th. The noise he makes in swallowing, the relish with which he smacks his lips, and the expression of hungry greed in his raised eyebrows irritate the man of learning. Make haste and finish. Oh, time is precious. You dictate. I can drink and write at the same time. I must confess, I was hungry. I should think so, after your walk. Yes, and what wretched weather. In our parts there is a scent of spring by now. There are puddles everywhere, the snow is melting. You're a southerner, I suppose? From the Don region. It's quite spring with us by March. Here it's frosty. Everyone's in a fur coat. But there you can see the grass. It's dry everywhere, and one can even catch tarantulas. And what do you catch tarantulas for? Oh, to pass the time. It's fun catching them. You fix a bit of pitch on a thread, let it down into their hole, and begin hitting the tarantula on the back with the pitch, and the brute gets cross, catches hold of the pitch with his claws, and gets stuck. Oh, and what we used to do with them. We used to put a basin full of them together and drop a behorka in with them. What is a behorka? That's another spider, very much the same as the tarantula. In a fight, one of them can kill 100 tarantulas. Oh. But we must write. Where did we stop? The man of learning dictates another 20 lines, then sits, plunged in meditation. Ivan Matveyitch, waiting while the other cogitates, sits, and craning his neck, puts the collar of his shirt to rights. His tie will not set properly. The stud has come out, and the collar keeps coming apart. Says the man of learning. Well, haven't you found a job yet, Ivan Matveyitch? No. And how is one to find one? I am thinking, you know, of volunteering for the army. But my father advises my going into a chemist's. But it would be better for you to go into the university. The examination is difficult, but with patience and hard work you could get through. Study, read more. Do you read much? Not much, I must own, says Ivan Matveyitch, lighting a cigarette. Have you read Turgenev? No. And Gogol? Gogol. No, I haven't read him. Ivan Matveyitch, aren't you ashamed? You're such a nice fellow. So much that is original in you, and you haven't even read Gogol. You must read him. I'll give you his works. It's essential to read him. We shall quarrel if you don't. The man of learning meditates, half reclining on a soft lounge, and Ivan Matveyitch, leaving his collar in peace, concentrates his whole attention on his boots. He has not till then noticed that 2 big puddles have been made by the snow melting off his boots on the floor. He's ashamed. I can't get on today, mutters the man of learning. I suppose you're fond of catching birds too, Ivan Matveyitch. That's in autumn. I don't catch them here, but there, at home, I always did. To be sure. Very good. But we must write, though. The man of learning gets up resolutely and begins dictating. But after 10 lines, sits down on the lounge again. No, perhaps we'd better put it off till tomorrow morning. Come tomorrow morning. Only come early, at 9 o'clock. God preserve you from being late. Ivan Matveyitch lays down his pen, gets up from the table, and sits in another chair. 5 minutes pass in silence, and he begins to feel it is time for him to go, that he is in the way. But in the man of learning's study, it is so snug and light and warm, and the impression of the nice rusks and sweet tea is still so fresh that there is a pang at his heart at the mere thought of home. At home there is poverty, hunger, cold, his grumbling father, scoldings, and here it is so quiet and unruffled, and interest is even taken in his tarantulas and birds. The man of learning looks at his watch and takes up a book. So you will give me Gogol, says Ivan Matveyitch, getting up. Yes. But, why are you in such a hurry, my dear boy? Sit down and tell me something. Ivan Matveyitch sits down and smiles broadly. Almost every evening he sits in this study, and always feels something extraordinarily soft attracting him, as it were akin in the voice and the glance of the man of learning. There are moments when he even fancies that the man of learning is becoming attached to him, used to him, and that if he scolds him for being late, it's simply because he misses his chatter about tarantulas and how they catch goldfinches on the Don.
Bad Weather by Anton Chekhov.
Big raindrops were pattering on the dark windows. It was one of those disgusting summer holiday rains, which when they've begun, last a long time, for weeks, till the frozen holiday-maker grows used to it and sinks into complete apathy. It was cold. There was a feeling of raw, unpleasant dampness. The mother-in-law of a lawyer, called Alexei Stepanovich Kvashin, and his wife, Nadezhda Filipovna, dressed in waterproofs and shawls, were sitting over the dinner table in the dining room. It was written on the countenance of the elder lady that she was, thank God, well fed, well clothed, and in good health, that she had married her only daughter to a good man, and could now play her game of patience with an easy conscience. Her daughter, a rather short, plump, fair young woman of 20, with a gently anemic face, was reading a book, with her elbows on the table. Judging from her eyes, she was not so much reading as thinking her own thoughts, which were not in the book. Neither of them spoke. There was the sound of the pattering rain, and from the kitchen they could hear the prolonged yawns of the cook. Kvashin himself was not at home. On rainy days he did not come to the summer villa, but stayed in town. Damp, rainy weather affected his bronchitis and prevented him from working. He was of the opinion that the sight of the grey sky and the tears of rain on the windows deprived one of energy and induced the spleen. In the town, where there was greater comfort, bad weather was scarcely noticed. After 2 games of patience, the old lady shuffled the cards and took a glance at her daughter. "I have been trying with the cards whether it will be fine tomorrow, and whether our Alexei Stepanovitch will come. It's 5 days since he was here. The weather is a chastisement from God." Nadyezhda Filipovna looked indifferently at her mother, got up, and began walking up and down the room. "The barometer was rising yesterday, but they say it is falling again today." The old lady laid out the cards in 3 long rows and shook her head. "Do you miss him?" she asked, glancing at her daughter. "Of course." "I see you do. I should think so. He hasn't been here for 5 days. In May the utmost was 2 or at most 3 days, and now it is serious, 5 days. I am not his wife, and yet I miss him. And yesterday, when I heard the barometer was rising, I ordered them to kill a chicken and prepare a carp for Alexei Stepanovitch. He likes them. Your poor father couldn't bear fish, but he likes it. He always eats it with relish." "My heart aches for him," said the daughter. "We are dull, but it is duller still for him, you know, Mamma." "I should think so. In the law courts, day in and day out, and in the empty flat at night, alone, like an owl." "And what is so awful, Mamma? He is alone there without servants. There's no one to set the samovar or bring him water. Why didn't he engage a valet for the summer months? And what use is the summer villa at all if he doesn't care for it? I told him there was no need to have it, but no, it's for the sake of your health, he said. And what's wrong with my health? It makes me ill that he should have to put up with so much on my account." Looking over her mother's shoulder, the daughter noticed a mistake in the patience. She bent down to the table and began correcting it. A silence followed. Both looked at the cards and imagined how their Alexei Stepanovitch, utterly forlorn, was sitting now in the town in his gloomy, empty study, and working, hungry, exhausted, and yearning for his family. "Do you know what, Mamma?" said Nadyezhda Filipovna suddenly, and her eyes began to shine. "If the weather is the same tomorrow, I'll go by the first train and see him in town. Anyway, I shall find out how he is, have a look at him, and pour out his tea." And both of them began to wonder how it was that this idea, so simple and easy to carry out, had not occurred to them before. It was only half an hour in the train to the town, and then 20 minutes in a cab. They said a little more, and went off to bed in the same room, feeling more contented. Oh, Lord, forgive us sinners," sighed the old lady when the clock in the hall struck 2. "There is no sleeping." "You're not asleep, Mamma?" the daughter asked. "I keep thinking of Alexei. I only hope he won't ruin his health in town. Goodness knows where he dines and lunches, in restaurants and taverns. I have thought of that myself, sighed the old lady. The Heavenly Mother save and preserve him. Oh, but the rain, the rain. In the morning, the rain was not pattering on the panes, but the sky was still grey. The trees stood looking mournful, and at every gust of wind they scattered drops. The footprints on the muddy path, the ditches and the ruts were full of water. Nadyezhda Filipovna made up her mind to go. "Give him my love," said the old lady, wrapping her daughter up. "Tell him not to think too much about his cases, and he must rest. Let him wrap his throat up when he goes out. The weather, God help us. And take him the chicken. Food from home, even if cold, is better than at a restaurant." The daughter went away, saying that she would come back by an evening train or else next morning. But she came back long before dinner time, when the old lady was sitting on her trunk in her bedroom and drowsily thinking what to cook for her son-in-law's supper. Going into the room, her daughter, pale and agitated, sank on the bed without uttering a word or taking off her hat, and pressed her head into the pillow. "But what is the matter?" said the old lady. "Why back so soon? Where is Alexei Stepanovitch?" Nadyezhda Filipovna raised her head and gazed at her mother with dry, imploring eyes. "He is deceiving us, Mamma." "What are you saying? Christ be with you!" cried the old lady, and her cap slipped off her head. "Who is going to deceive us? Lord have mercy on us!" "He is deceiving us, Mamma," repeated her daughter, and her chin began to quiver. "How do you know?" cried the old lady, turning pale. "Our flat is locked up. The porter tells me that Alexei has not been home once for these 5 days. He's not living at home. He's not at home. Not at home." She waved her hands and burst into loud weeping, uttering nothing but "not at home, not at home." She began to be hysterical. "What's the meaning of it? Why, he wrote the day before yesterday that he never leaves the flat. Where is he sleeping? Holy saints!" Nadyezhda Filipovna felt so faint that she could not take off her hat. She looked about her blankly, as though she had been drugged, and convulsively clutched at her mother's arms. "What a person to trust! A porter!" said the old lady, fussing round her daughter and crying, "What a jealous girl you are! He's not going to deceive you. And how dare he? We are not just anybody. Though we are of the merchant class, yet he has no right, for you are his lawful wife. We can take proceedings. I gave 20,000 roubles with you. You did not want a dowry." And the old lady herself sobbed and gesticulated, and she felt faint too, and lay down on her trunk. Neither of them noticed that patches of blue had made their appearance in the sky, that the clouds were more transparent, that the first sunbeam was cautiously gliding over the wet grass in the garden, that with renewed gaiety the sparrows were hopping about the puddles which reflected the racing clouds. Towards evening, Kvashin arrived. Before leaving town, he had gone to his flat and had learned from the porter that his wife had come in his absence. "Here I am," he said, coming into his mother-in-law's room and pretending not to notice their stern and tear-stained faces. "Here I am. It's 5 days since we've seen each other." He rapidly kissed his wife's hand and his mother-in-law's, and with the air of a man delighted to have finished a difficult task, he lolled into an armchair. "Oh, here I've been worried to death. I've scarcely sat down for almost 5 days now. I've been, as it were, bivouacking. I haven't been to the flat once. Would you believe it? I've been, busy the whole time with a meeting of Shipunov's and Ivanchikov's creditors. I had to work in Galdiev's office at the shop. I've had nothing to eat or drink and slept on a bench. I was chilled through. Oh, I hadn't a free minute. Haven't even had time to go to the flat. That's how I came not to be at home, Nadezhda. And Kvashin, holding his sides as though his back were aching, glanced stealthily at his wife and mother-in-law to see the effect of his lie, or as he called it, diplomacy. The mother-in-law and wife were looking at each other in joyful astonishment, as though beyond all hope and expectation they had found something precious which they had lost. Their faces beamed. Their eyes glowed. "My dear man," cried the old lady, jumping up, "why am I sitting here? Tea! Tea at once! Perhaps you're hungry." "Of course he is hungry," cried his wife, pulling off her head a bandage soaked in vinegar. "Mamma, bring the wine and the savouries. Natalia, lay the table. Oh, my goodness, nothing's ready." And both of them, frightened, happy and bustling, ran about the room. The old lady could not look without laughing at her daughter, who had slandered an innocent man, and the daughter felt ashamed. The table was soon laid. Kvashin, who smelt of Madeira and liqueurs, and who could scarcely breathe from repletion, complained of being hungry, forced himself to much, and kept on talking of the meeting of Shipunov's and Ivanchikov's creditors, while his wife and mother-in-law could not take their eyes off his face, and both thought, how clever and kind he is, how handsome. "All serene," thought Kvashin, as he lay down on the well-filled feather bed. "They are regular tradesmen's wives. They are Philistines. Yet they have a charm of their own. And one can spend a day or two of the week here, with enjoyment." He wrapped himself up, got warm, and as he dozed off, he said to himself, "All serene."
The Portrait of a Gentleman by William Somerset Maugham. I arrived in Seoul towards evening, and after dinner, tired by the long railway journey from Peking, to stretch my cramped legs I went for a walk. I wandered at random along a narrow and busy street. The Koreans, in their long white gowns and their little white top hats, were amusing to look at, and the open shops displayed wares that arrested my foreign eyes. Presently I came to a second-hand bookseller's, and catching sight of shelves filled with English books, went in to have a look at them. I glanced at the titles, and my heart sank. They were commentaries on the Old Testament, treatises on the epistles of St. Paul, sermons and lives of divines doubtless eminent, but whose names were unfamiliar to me. I am an ignorant person. I supposed that this was the library of some missionary whom death had claimed in the midst of his labours, and whose books then had been purchased by a Japanese bookseller. The Japanese are astute, but I could not imagine who in Seoul would be found to buy a work in 3 volumes on the Epistle to the Corinthians. But as I was turning away between Volume 2 and Volume 3 of this treatise, I noticed a little book bound in paper. I do not know what induced me to take it out. It was called The Complete Poker Player, and its cover was illustrated with a hand holding 4 aces. I looked at the title page. The author was Mr. John Blackridge, actuary and counsellor at law, and the preface was dated 1879. I wondered how this work happened to be among the books of a deceased missionary, and I looked in 1 or 2 of them to see if I could find his name. Perhaps it was there only by accident. It may be that it was the entire library of a stranded gambler, and had found its way to those shelves when his effects were sold to pay his hotel bill. But I prefer to think that it was indeed the property of the missionary, and that when he was weary of reading divinity, he rested his mind by the perusal of these lively pages. Perhaps somewhere in Korea, at night, and alone in his mission house, he dealt innumerable poker hands in order to see for himself whether you could really only get a straight flush once in 65,000 hands. But the owner of the shop was looking at me with disfavour, so I turned to him and asked the price of the book. He gave it a contemptuous glance and told me I could have it for 20 sen. I put it in my pocket. I do not remember that, for so small a sum, I have ever purchased better entertainment. For Mr. John Blackridge, in these pages of his, did a thing that no writer can do who deliberately tries to, but that, if done unconsciously, gives a book a rare and precious savour. He painted a complete portrait of himself. He stands before the reader so vividly that I was convinced that a woodcut of him figured as a frontispiece, and I was surprised to discover, on looking at the book again the other day, that there was nothing of the kind. I see him very distinctly as a man of middle age, in a black frock-coat and a chimney-pot hat, wearing a black satin stock. He is clean-shaven, and his jaw is square. His lips are thin, and his eyes wary. His face is sallow and somewhat wrinkled. It is a countenance not without severity, but when he tells a story or makes one of his dry jokes, his eyes light up and his smile is winning. He enjoyed his bottle of Burgundy, but I cannot believe that he ever drank enough to confuse his excellent faculties. He was just rather than merciful at the card table, and he was prepared to punish presumption with rigour. He had few illusions, for here are some of the things that life had taught him. Men hate those whom they have injured. Men love those whom they have benefited. Men naturally avoid their benefactors. Men are universally actuated by self-interest. Gratitude is a lively sense of expected benefits. Promises are never forgotten by those to whom they are made, usually by those who make them. It may be presumed that he was a Southerner, for while speaking of jackpots, which he describes as a frivolous attempt to make the game more interesting, he remarks that they are not popular in the South. This last fact, he says, contains much promise, because the South is the conservative portion of the country, and may be relied on as the last resort of good sense in social matters. The revolutionary Kossuth made no progress below Richmond. Neither spiritualism, nor free love, nor communism has ever been received with the least favour by the Southern mind, and it is for this reason that we greatly respect the Southern verdict upon the jackpot. It was in his day an innovation, and he condemned it. The time has arrived when all additions to the present standard combinations in draw poker must be worthless, the game being complete. The jackpot, he says, was invented in Toledo, Ohio, by reckless players to compensate losses incurred by playing against cautious players, and the principle is the same as if a party should play whist for stakes, and all be obliged every few minutes to stop and purchase tickets in a lottery, or raffle for a turkey, or share a deal in keno. Poker is a game for gentlemen. He does not hesitate to make frequent use of this abused word. He lived in a day when to be a gentleman had its obligations, but also its privileges, and a straight flush is to be respected, not because you make money on it. I have never seen anyone make much money upon a straight flush, he says, but because it prevents any hand from being absolutely the winning hand, and thus relieves gentlemen from the necessity of betting on a certainty.
without the use of straights, and hence without the use of a straight flush, for aces would be a certainty, and no gentleman could do more than call on them. This, I confess, catches me on the raw, for once in my life I had a straight flush, and bet on it till I was called. Mr. John Blackridge had personal dignity, rectitude, humour, and common sense. The amusements of mankind, he says, have not as yet received proper recognition at the hands of the makers of the civil law, and of the unwritten social law. And he had no patience with the persons who condemn the most agreeable pastime that has been invented, namely gambling, because risk is attached to it. Every transaction in life is a risk, he truly observes, and involves the question of loss and gain. To retire to rest at night is a practice that is fortified by countless precedents, and it is generally regarded as prudent and necessary. Yet it is surrounded by risks of every kind. He enumerates them, and finally sums up his argument with these reasonable words. If social circles welcome the banker and merchant who live by taking fair risks for the sake of profit, there is no apparent reason why they should not at least tolerate the man who at times employs himself in giving and taking fair risks for the sake of amusement. But here his good sense is obvious. 20 years of experience in the city of New York, both professionally — you must not forget that he is an actuary and counsellor at law — and as a student of social life, satisfy me that the average American gentleman in a large city has not over $3,000 a year to spend upon amusements. Will it be fair to devote more than 1/3 of this fund to cards? I do not think that anyone will say that 1/3 is not ample allowance for a single amusement. Given, therefore, $1,000 a year for the purpose of playing draw poker, what should be the limit of the stakes, in order that the average American gentleman may play the game with a contented mind, and with the certainty not only that he can pay his losses, but that his winnings will be paid to him? Mr. Blackridge has no doubt that the answer is $2.50. The game of poker should be intellectual and not emotional, and it is impossible to exclude the emotions from it. If the stakes are so high that the question of loss and gain penetrates to the feelings. From this quotation it may be seen that Mr. Blackridge looked upon poker as only on the side a game of chance. He considered that it needed as much force of character, mental ability, power of decision, and insight into motive to play poker as to govern a country or to lead an army, and I have an idea that on the whole he would have thought it a more sensible use of a man's faculties. I am tempted to quote interminably, for Mr. Blackridge seldom writes a sentence that is other than characteristic, and his language is excellent. It is dignified as befits his subject and his condition. He does not forget that he is a gentleman. Measured, clear, and pointed. His phrase takes an ample sweep when he treats of mankind and its foibles, but he can be as direct and simple as you please. Could anything be better than this terse but adequate description of a card sharper? He was a very good-looking man of about 40 years of age, having the appearance of one who had been leading a temperate and thoughtful life. But I will content myself with giving a few of his aphorisms and wise saws chosen almost at random from the wealth of his book. Let your chips talk for you. A silent player is so far forth a mystery, and a mystery is always feared. In this game never do anything that you are not compelled to, while cheerfully responding to your obligations. At draw poker, all statements not called for by the laws of the game, or supported by ocular demonstration, may be set down as fictitious, designed to enliven the path of truth throughout the game, as flowers in summer enliven the margins of the highway. Lost money is never recovered. After losing you may win, but the losing does not bring the winning. No gentleman will ever play any game of cards with the design of habitually winning and never losing. A gentleman is always willing to pay a fair price for recreation and amusement. That habit of mind, which continually leads us to undervalue the mental force of other men, while we continually overvalue their good luck. The injury done to your capital by a loss is never compensated by the benefit done to your capital by a gain of the same amount. Players usually straddle when they are in bad luck, upon the principle that bad play and bad luck united will win. A slight degree of intoxication aids to perfect this intellectual deduction. Euchre is a contemptible game. The lower cards, as well as the lower classes, are only useful in combination or in excess, and cannot be depended upon under any other circumstances. It is a hard matter to hold 4 aces as steadily as a pair, but the table will bear their weight with as much equanimity as a pair of deuces. Of good luck and bad luck. To feel emotions over such incidents is unworthy of a man, and it is much more unworthy to express them. But no words need be wasted over practices which all men despise in others, and in their reflecting moments lament in themselves. Endorsing for your friends is a bad habit, but it is nothing to playing poker on credit. Debit and credit ought never to interfere with the fine intellectual calculations of this game. There is a grand ring in his remarks on the player who has trained his intellect to bring logic to bear upon the principles and phenomena of the game. He will thus feel a constant sense of security amid all possible fluctuations that occur, and he will also abstain from pressing an ignorant or an intellectually weak opponent beyond what may be necessary either for the purpose of playing the game correctly or of punishing presumption. I leave Mr. John Blackridge with this last word, and I can hear him saying it gently, but with a tolerant smile, for we must take human nature as it is. The Man with the Scar by William Somerset Maugham. It was on account of the scar that I first noticed him, for it ran broad and red in a great crescent from his temple to his chin. It must have been due to a formidable wound, and I wondered whether this had been caused by a sabre or by a fragment of shell. It was unexpected on that round, fat, and good-humoured face. He had small and undistinguished features, and his expression was artless. His face went oddly with his corpulent body. He was a powerful man of more than common height. I never saw him in anything but a very shabby grey suit, a khaki shirt, and a battered sombrero. He was far from clean. He used to come into the Palace Hotel at Guatemala City every day at cocktail time, and strolling leisurely round the bar, offer lottery tickets for sale. If this was the way he made his living, it must have been a poor one, for I never saw anyone buy, but now and then I saw him offered a drink. He never refused it. He threaded his way among the tables with a sort of rolling walk, as though he were accustomed to traverse long distances on foot, paused at each table, with a little smile mentioned the numbers he had for sale, and then, when no notice was taken of him, with the same smile passed on. I think he was, for the most part, a trifle the worse for liquor. I was standing at the bar one evening, my foot on the rail, with an acquaintance. They make a very good dry martini at the Palace Hotel in Guatemala City, when the man with the scar came up. I shook my head, as for the 20th time since my arrival he held out for my inspection his lottery tickets. But my companion nodded affably. "¿Qué tal, General? How is life?" "Not so bad. Business is none too good, but it might be worse." "What will you have, General?" "A brandy." He tossed it down and put the glass back on the bar. He nodded to my acquaintance. "Gracias. Hasta luego." Then he turned away and offered his tickets to the men who were standing next to us. "Who is your friend?" I asked. "That's a terrific scar on his face." "It doesn't add to his beauty, does it? He's an exile from Nicaragua. He's a ruffian, of course, and a bandit, but not a bad fellow. I gave him a few pesos now and then. He was a revolutionary general, and if his ammunition hadn't given out, he'd have upset the government and be Minister of War now, instead of selling lottery tickets in Guatemala. They captured him along with his staff, such as it was, and tried him by court-martial. Such things are rather summary in these countries, you know, and he was sentenced to be shot at dawn. I guess he knew what was coming to him when he was caught. He spent the night in jail, and he and the others, there were 5 of them altogether, passed the time playing poker. They used matches for chips. He told me he'd never had such a run of bad luck in his life. They were playing with a short pack, jacks to open, but he never held a card. He never improved more than 6 times in the whole sitting, and no sooner did he buy a new stack than he lost it. When day broke and the soldiers came into the cell to fetch them for execution, he had lost more matches than a reasonable man could use in a lifetime. They were led into the patio of the jail and placed against a wall, the 5 of them side by side, with the firing party facing them. There was a pause, and our friend asked the officer in charge of them what the devil they were keeping him waiting for. The officer said that the general commanding the government troops wished to attend the execution, and they waited for his arrival. "Then I have time to smoke another cigarette," said our friend. He was always unpunctual. But he had barely lit it when the general, it was San Ignacio, by the way, I don't know whether you ever met him, followed by his ADC, came into the patio. The usual formalities were performed, and San Ignacio asked the condemned men whether there was anything they wished before the execution took place. 4 of the 5 shook their heads, but our friend spoke. "Yes, I should like to say goodbye to my wife." "Bueno," said the general. "I have no objection to that. Where is she?" "She's waiting at the prison door." "Then it will not cause a delay of more than 5 minutes." "Hardly that, Senor General," said our friend. "Have him placed on one side." 2 soldiers advanced, and between them the condemned rebel walked to the spot indicated. The officer in command of the firing squad, on a nod from the general, gave an order. There was a ragged report, and the 4 men fell. They fell strangely, not together, but one after the other, with movements that were almost grotesque, as though they were puppets in a toy theatre. The officer went up to them, and into one, who was still alive, emptied 2 barrels of his revolver. Our friend finished his cigarette and threw away the stub. There was a little stir at the gateway. A woman came into the patio with quick steps, and then, her hand on her heart, stopped suddenly. She gave a cry, and with outstretched arms ran forward. "Caramba," said the general. She was in black, with a veil over her hair, and her face was dead white. She was hardly more than a girl, a slim creature, with little regular features and enormous eyes, but they were distraught with anguish. Her loveliness was such that as she ran, her mouth slightly open, and the agony of her face beautiful, a gasp of surprise was wrung from those indifferent soldiers who looked at her. The rebel advanced a step or two to meet her. She flung herself into his arms, and with a hoarse cry of passion, "Alma de mi corazón, soul of my heart," he pressed his lips to hers. And at the same moment he drew a knife from his ragged shirt. I haven't a notion how he managed to retain possession of it, and stabbed her in the neck. The blood spurted from the cut vein and dyed his shirt. Then he flung his arms round her and once more pressed his lips to hers. It happened so quickly that many did not know what had occurred, but from the others burst a cry of horror. They sprang forward and seized him. They loosened his grip, and the girl would have fallen if the ADC had not caught her. She was unconscious. They laid her on the ground, and with dismay on their faces stood round watching her. The rebel knew where he was striking, and it was impossible to staunch the blood. In a moment the ADC, who had been kneeling by her side, rose. "She's dead," he whispered. The rebel crossed himself. "Why did you do it?" asked the general. "I loved her." A sort of sigh passed through those men crowded together, and they looked with strange faces at the murderer. The general stared at him for a while in silence. "It was a noble gesture," he said at last. "I cannot execute this man. Take my car and have him led to the frontier. Senor, I offer you the homage which is due from one brave man to another." A murmur of approbation broke from those who listened. The ADC tapped the rebel on the shoulder, and between the two soldiers, without a word, he marched to the waiting car. My friend stopped, and for a little I was silent. I must explain that he was a Guatemaltecan, and spoke to me in Spanish. I have translated what he told me as well as I could, but I have made no attempt to tone down his rather high-flown language. To tell the truth, I think it suits the story. "But how, then, did he get the scar?" I asked at length. "Oh, that was due to a bottle that burst when I was opening it. A bottle of ginger ale." "I never liked it," said I.
Edward the Conqueror, read by Joanna David.
Louisa stepped out of the kitchen door at the back of the house into the cool October sunshine. "Edward!" she called. "Edward! Lunch is ready!" She paused a moment, listening. Then she strolled out onto the lawn and continued across it. She could see him now, about 80 yards away, down in the dip on the edge of the wood, the tallish, narrow figure in khaki slacks and a dark green sweater, working beside a big bonfire. Louisa went down the slope towards her husband. "Lunch," she said, approaching. "Oh, hello. All right, yes, I'm coming." "Oh, Edward, look!" Louisa was pointing to the far side of the bonfire. "Look! The cat!" Sitting on the ground, so close to the fire that the flame seemed actually to be touching it, was a large cat of a most unusual colour. It stayed quite still, with its head on one side and its nose in the air, watching the man and woman with a cool yellow eye. "It'll get burnt!" Louisa cried, and she darted swiftly in and grabbed it with both hands, whisking it away and putting it on the grass well clear of the flames. "Whose is it?" she said. "You ever seen it before?" "No, damn peculiar colour." For a cat, it certainly had an unusual colour, a pure silvery grey, with no blue in it at all, and the hair was very long and silky. Louisa bent down and stroked its head. "Be a good cat now, and go home to where you belong." The man and wife started to stroll back up the hill towards the house. The cat got up and followed them. "Go home," the man said. "We don't want you." But when they reached the house, it came in with them, and Louisa gave it some milk in the kitchen. During lunch, it hopped up onto the spare chair between them, and sat through the meal with its head just above the level of the table, watching the proceedings with those dark yellow eyes, which kept moving slowly from the woman to the man and back again. "I don't like this cat," Edward said. "Oh, I think it's a beautiful cat. I do hope it stays a little while. No, listen to me, Louisa. The creature can't possibly stay here. It's lost. This afternoon you'd better take it to the police. They'll see it gets home." After lunch, Edward returned to his gardening. Louisa, as usual, went to the piano. She was a competent pianist and a genuine music lover, and almost every afternoon she spent an hour or so playing. The cat was now lying on the sofa, and she paused to stroke it as she went by. Her fingers, moving over the fur on the cat's head, came into contact with a small lump, a little growth just above the right eye. "Poor cat," she said. "You've got bumps on your beautiful face. You must be getting old." She went over and sat down on the long piano stool, but she didn't immediately start to play. One of her pleasures was to make every day a kind of concert day, with a carefully arranged programme which she worked out in detail before she began. How about some Bach to begin with? Or better still, Vivaldi. The Bach adaptation for organ of the D minor Concerto Grosso. After that, a touch of Liszt. One of the Petrarch sonnets, the E major, then Schumann, Kinderszenen. She moved herself a little closer to the piano and lifted her hands to the keyboard and began to play. As the first notes of Vivaldi sounded softly in the room, she became aware of a sudden flurry, a flash of movement on the sofa to her right. She stopped playing at once. "What is it?" she said, turning to the cat. "What's the matter?" The animal, who a few seconds before had been sleeping peacefully, was now sitting bolt upright on the sofa, very tense, ears and eyes wide open, staring at the piano. "Did I frighten you?" she asked gently. "Perhaps you've never heard music before." "No," she told herself. "I don't think that's what it is." On second thoughts, it seemed to her that the cat's attitude was not one of fear. If anything, there was a kind of eagerness about the creature. Louisa was watching closely now, and because she was curious to see what would happen a second time, she reached out her hands to the keyboard and began again to play the Vivaldi. This time the cat was ready for it, and all that happened to begin with was a small extra tensing of the body. But as the music swelled and quickened into that first exciting rhythm of the introduction to the fugue, a strange look that amounted almost to ecstasy began to settle upon the creature's face. The ears, which up to then had been pricked up straight, were gradually drawn back. The eyelids drooped. The head went over to one side, and at that moment Louisa could have sworn that the animal was actually appreciating the work. Then she thought, maybe it's a sort of hypnotic reaction, like with snakes. After all, if you can charm a snake with music, why not a cat? Except that millions of cats hear the stuff every day of their lives, on radio and gramophone and piano, and as far as she knew, there'd never yet been a case of one behaving like this. Louisa went straight into Liszt's Petrarch sonnet. And now an extraordinary thing happened. She hadn't played more than 3 or 4 bars when the animal's whiskers began perceptibly to twitch. Slowly it drew itself up to an extra height. Then all at once it bounded to the floor and leapt up onto the piano stool beside her. There it sat, listening intently to the lovely sonnet, very erect, the large yellow eyes fixed upon Louisa's fingers. "Well," she said as she struck the last chord, "so you came up to sit beside me, did you?" She put out a hand and stroked the cat softly. "That was Liszt," she went on. "Mind you, he can sometimes be quite horribly vulgar, but in things like this he's really charming." She was beginning to enjoy this odd animal pantomime, So she went straight on into the next item on the programme, Schumann's Kinderscenen. She hadn't been playing for more than a minute or two when she realised that the cat had moved and was now back in its old place on the sofa. It was still staring at her, still apparently attending closely to the music, and yet it seemed that there was not now the same rapturous enthusiasm there'd been during the list. In addition, the act of leaving the stool and returning to the sofa appeared in itself to be a mild but positive gesture of disappointment. "All right," she said. "You seem to like Liszt so much. I'll give you another." Softly she began to play one of the 12 little pieces from Der Weihnachtsbaum. The cat jumped down, walked around the piano, hopped up on the stool, and sat down beside her again. They were in the middle of all this when Edward came in from the garden. "Edward!" Louisa cried, jumping up. "Listen to what's happened." "What is it?" he said. "I'd like some tea." "It's the cat," she cried, pointing to it sitting quietly on the piano stool. "I thought I told you to take it to the police. But, Edward, this cat can appreciate music, and it can understand it too." "Nonsense, Louisa. For God's sake, let's have some tea." He sat down in an armchair, took a cigarette from a box beside him, and lit it with an immense patent lighter that stood near the box. "What you don't understand," Louisa said, "is that something extremely exciting has been happening here, in our own house, something that may even be, well, almost momentous." She was standing by the piano, her pink face pinker than ever, a scarlet rose high up on each cheek. I think it might be possible that we are at this moment sitting in the presence of—" She stopped, as though suddenly sensing the absurdity of the thought. "In the presence of whom, for heaven's sake?" "Of Franz Liszt himself." Her husband took a long, slow pull at his cigarette and blew the smoke up at the ceiling. "I don't get you," he said. "Edward, listen to me. From what I've seen this afternoon, with my own eyes, it really looks as though this might be some sort of reincarnation. You're not ill, are you, Louisa?" "I'm perfectly all right. I'm a bit confused, I don't mind admitting it. But who wouldn't be after what's just happened? What did happen, if I may ask?" Louisa told him, and all the while she was speaking her husband lay sprawled in the chair, a thin, cynical smile on his mouth. "I don't see anything very unusual about that," he said. "It's been taught tricks, that's all." "Don't be so silly, Edward. Every time I play Liszt, he gets all excited and comes running over to sit on the stool beside me. But only for Liszt, and nobody can teach a cat the difference between Liszt and Schumann. You don't even know it yourself, but this one can do it every single time." "Twice," the husband said. "He's only done it twice. Let's see him do it again. Come on." "No," Louisa said. "Definitely not. Because if this is Liszt, or anyway the soul of Liszt, then it's certainly not right to put him through a lot of silly, undignified tests. But I'll tell you what I will do. I'll play him a little more of his own music. One thing is certain. As soon as he recognizes it, he'll refuse to budge off that stool where he's sitting now." She chose the B-minor sonata. She had meant to play only the first part of the work, but once she got started and saw how the cat was sitting there watching her hands with that rapturous, concentrated look, she didn't have the heart to stop. "There you are," she said. "You can't tell me he wasn't absolutely loving it. He just likes the noise, that's all. He was loving it. Oh, my goodness, if only he could talk. Just think of it. He met Beethoven in his youth. He knew Schubert and Mendelssohn and Schumann and Berlioz. My heavens, he was Wagner's father-in-law." "Louisa," her husband said sharply, sitting up straight, "tell me something. You don't really believe this twaddle you're talking, do you?" "Of course I do. I don't think there's any question about it now." "You know what I think," he said. "I think you ought to see a doctor. And damn quick, too." With that, he stalked through the French windows back into the garden. Soon, Louisa was in the car driving to town. She parked in front of the library, hurried into the building, and headed straight for the reference room. There she began searching the cards for books on 2 subjects, reincarnation and Liszt. She found something called Recurring Earth Lives by a man called F. Milton Willis. Under Liszt, she found 2 biographical volumes. She took out all 3. Back home, she prepared to do some serious reading. She would begin, she decided, with Mr. F. Milton Willis's work. The doctrine of reincarnation, she read, states that spiritual souls pass from higher to higher forms of animals. A man can, for instance, no more be reborn as an animal than an adult can re-become a child. She read this again. But how could he know? How could he be so sure? He couldn't. No one could possibly be certain about a thing like that. Mr. F. Milton Willis was nothing but a guesser. She was not impressed. Louisa now turned to one of the Liszt biographies, and she was glancing through it casually when her husband came in again from the garden. "What are you doing now?" he asked. Louisa didn't seem to hear him. She was staring open-mouthed at a picture of Liszt in the book that lay on her lap. My God! Look! The warts on his face! I forgot all about them. He had these great warts on his face. The cat has them too. I'll show you. She took the animal onto her lap and began examining its face. Now in the picture, there's one above the right eyebrow. Louisa looked above the right eyebrow of the cat. Yes, it's there, in exactly the same place, and another on the left at the top of the nose. That one's there as well, and one just below it on the cheek, and 2 fairly close together under the chin on the right side. Edward, come and look. They're exactly the same. It doesn't prove a thing. Louisa turned back to the book and began reading some more. "This is interesting," she said. "It says here that Liszt loved all of Chopin's work except the scherzo in B-flat minor. Apparently he hated that. He called it the governor's scherzo, and said that it ought to be reserved solely for people in that profession." "So what?" "Edward, listen. I'm going to play this scherzo right now, and you can stay here and see what happens. And then maybe you will deign to get us some supper." When Louisa began to play, the first effect was as dramatic as ever. The animal jumped as though it had been stung, and it stood motionless for at least a minute. Then it became restless and began to walk back and forth along the length of the sofa. Finally, it hopped down onto the floor, and with its nose and tail held high in the air, it marched slowly, majestically from the room. "There!" Louisa cried, jumping up and running after it. "That does it! That really proves it!" She came back carrying the cat, which she put down again on the sofa. "What about it, Edward? What do you think?" "I must say, it was quite amusing." "Amusing? My dear Edward, it's the most wonderful thing that's ever happened. Oh, goodness me," she cried, picking up the cat again and hugging it to her bosom. "Isn't it marvellous? To think we've got Franz Liszt staying in the house." "Louisa, don't get hysterical." "And do you know what I'm going to do next? Every musician in the whole world is going to want to meet him, just to see him and touch him, and to play their own music to him. So I'm going to invite them to visit him. No, I'm not having it. Not in this house. It'll make us both look perfect fools." Louisa put the cat slowly down on the sofa. Then she took one pace forward. "Damn you, Edward," she shouted. "For the first time in our lives, something really exciting comes along, and you're scared to death of having anything to do with it, because someone may laugh at you." "Louisa," he said, "that's quite enough of that. Listen, I've been working all day in the garden, and I'm tired and hungry, and I want some supper. So do you. Off you go now to the kitchen, and get both of us something to eat." Louisa stepped back and put both hands to her mouth. "My heavens!" she cried. "I forgot all about it. He must be absolutely famished. Except for some milk, I haven't given him a thing to eat since he arrived. I must cook him something really special. God damn it, Louisa. Now, Edward, please. I'm going to handle this my way just for once. You stay here," she said, bending down and touching the cat gently with her fingers. "I won't be long." Louisa went into the kitchen and stood for a moment wondering what she might prepare. How about a nice cheese soufflé? Yes, that would be rather special. Edward didn't much care for them, but that couldn't be helped. She was only a fair cook, and she couldn't be sure of always having a soufflé come out well, but she took extra trouble this time, and waited a long while to make certain the oven had heated to the correct temperature. When it was ready, she put it on a tray and carried it into the living room. At the exact moment she entered, she saw her husband coming in through the French windows from the garden. "Here's his supper," she said, putting it on the table and turning towards the sofa. "Where is he?" Her husband closed the garden door behind him and walked across the room to get himself a cigarette. "Edward? Where is he?" "Who?" "You know who." "Ah, yes. Well, I'll tell you." He was bending forward to light the cigarette, and his hands were cupped around the lighter. He glanced up and saw Louisa looking at him, at his shoes, at the bottoms of his khaki slacks, which were damp from walking in long grass. "I just went out to see how the bonfire was going," he said. Her eyes travelled slowly upwards and rested on his hands. "It's still burning fine," he went on. "I think it'll keep going all night." But the way she was staring made him uncomfortable. "What is it?" he said, lowering the lighter. Then he looked down and noticed for the first time the long, thin scratch that ran diagonally clear across the back of one hand from the knuckle to the wrist. "Edward!" "Yes," he said. "Those brambles are terrible. They tear you to pieces." "Edward! For God's sake, woman, sit down and keep calm. There's nothing to get worked up about. Louisa! Louisa! Sit down!"
Nick, read by Tom Hollander.
When about 8 years ago old Sir William Turton died, and his son Basil inherited the Turton Press, as well as the title, I can remember how they started laying bets around Fleet Street as to just how long it would be before some nice young woman managed to persuade the little fellow that she must look after him. That is to say, him and his money. The new Sir Basil Turton was maybe 40 years old at the time, a bachelor, a man of mild and simple character, who up to then had shown no interest in anything at all except his collection of modern paintings and sculpture. Naturally, the vultures started gathering at once, and I believe that not only Fleet Street, but very nearly the whole of the city was looking on eagerly as they scrambled for the body. But to everyone's surprise, the little chap proved to be remarkably elusive. Then, round about the beginning of August, the girls declared a sort of truce amongst themselves while they went abroad, and rested, and made fresh plans for the winter kill. This was a mistake, because precisely at that moment a dazzling creature called Natalia something or other, whom nobody had heard of before, swept in from the continent, took Sir Basil firmly by the wrist, and led him off in a kind of swoon to Caxton Hall, where she married him before anyone else, least of all the bridegroom, realized what was happening. You can imagine that the London ladies were indignant, but we don't have to go into that. In fact, for the purposes of this story, we can skip the next 6 years, which brings us right up to the present, to an occasion when I myself had the pleasure of meeting her ladyship for the first time. By now, As you must have guessed, she was not only running the whole of the Turton press, but as a result had become a considerable political force in the country. Last Thursday I went to this small dinner party at a friend's in London, and while we were standing around in the drawing-room before the meal, sipping good martinis and talking about the atom bomb and Mr. Bevan, the maid popped her head in to announce the last guest. "Lady Turton," she said. Our eyes swung round to the door, waiting for the entrance. She came in fast, tall and slim, and in a red-gold dress with sparkles on it, and my heavens, I must say she was a beauty. The hair was black, and to go with it she had one of those pale, oval, innocent 15th-century Flemish faces, almost exactly a Madonna by Memling or Van Eyck. At least, that was the first impression. Later, I got a closer look and saw that except for the outline and colouring, it wasn't really a Madonna at all. Far, far from it. The nostrils, for example, were very odd, flaring and excessively arched. This gave the whole nose a kind of open, snorting look that had something of the wild animal about it, the mustang. A few minutes later we went into dinner, and to my surprise I found myself seated on her ladyship's right. I presumed that our hostess had done this as a kindness to me, thinking I might pick up some material for the special column I write each day in the evening paper. I smiled and made a little bow. She didn't smile back, but started shooting questions at me, rather personal questions, job, age, family, things like that. During this inquisition it came out among other things that I was a lover of painting and sculpture. "Then you should come down to the country sometime and see my husband's collection." And that was how, on the following Saturday afternoon, I came to be driving down to Wootton with my suitcase in the back of the car. As you know, Wootton is one of the truly great stone houses of the early English Renaissance. Like its sisters, Longleat, Woollerton, and Montacute, it was built in the latter half of the 16th century, when for the first time a great man's house could be designed as a comfortable dwelling, not a castle. As I drove into the forecourt, I noticed with rather a shock that the fountain basin in the middle supported a large statue by Epstein. A lovely thing, mind you, but surely not quite in sympathy with its surroundings. The door was opened by a young footman who led me up to a bedroom on the first floor. Her ladyship, he explained, was resting. Now, in my job it's necessary to do a lot of weekending, and as a result I've become fairly sensitive to unfamiliar atmosphere. I can tell good or bad almost by sniffing with my nose the moment I get in the front door, and this one I was in now I did not like. Later, I was sitting on the bed when softly the door opened, and an ancient, lopsided gnome in black tails slid into the room. He was the butler, he explained, and his name was Jelks, and he did so hope I was comfortable and had everything I wanted. I told him that I was, and had. "Her ladyship will be down at 7 o'clock. So will Major Haddock and the others." I noticed there was a trace of a sneer around the corners of Jelks's nose. He spoke the words with the outsides of his lips, as though he were nibbling a lemon. Then he slipped out of the door, leaving behind him a certain dampness in the room, and a faint smell of embrocation. Shortly after 7, I found my way to the main drawing-room, and Lady Turton, as beautiful as ever, got up to greet me. "I wasn't even sure you were coming," she said. "I'm afraid I took you at your word, Lady Turton. I hope it's all right." "Why not?" she said. "There are 47 bedrooms in the house. This is my husband." A small man came round the back of her and said, "You know, I'm so glad you were able to come." He had a warm smile, and when he took my hand, I felt instantly a touch of friendship in his fingers. "And Carmen La Rosa," Lady Turton said. This was a powerfully built woman who looked as though she might have something to do with horses. "And this is Jack Haddock." I knew this man slightly. He was a director of companies, whatever that means, and a well-known member of society. I had used his name a few times in my column, but I'd never liked him. And this, I think, was mainly because I have a deep suspicion of all people who carry their military titles back with them into private life, especially majors and colonels. "I hope you're going to say some nice things about us in your column." "He better had," Lady Turton said, "or I'll say some nasty ones about him on my front page." I laughed, but Sir Basil drew me gently aside for a quiet chat at the other end of the room. Every now and then Lady Turton would call her husband to fetch her something, another martini, a cigarette, and he, half rising from his chair, would be forestalled by the watchful Jelks, who fetched it for him. Clearly Jelks loved his master, and just as clearly he hated the wife. Each time he did something for her he drew his lips together so they puckered like a turkey's bottom. At dinner our hostess sat her two friends, Haddock and La Rosa, on either side of her. This left Sir Basil and me at the other end of the table, where we were able to talk about painting and sculpture. Of course it was obvious to me by now that the Major was infatuated with her ladyship, and again, although I hate to say it, it seemed as though the La Rosa woman was hunting the same bird. All this foolishness appeared to delight the hostess, but not her husband. I could see that he was conscious of the little scene all the time we were talking, and often his mind would wander from our subject, and he would stop short in mid-sentence, his eyes travelling down to the other end of the table to settle pathetically for a moment on that lovely head with the black hair and the curiously flaring nostrils. He must have noticed how exhilarated she was, how the hand that gestured as she spoke rested every now and again on the Major's arm. "Tomorrow," I said, "you must take me round and show me the sculptures you've put up in the garden." "Of course," he said, "with pleasure." He glanced again at his wife, and his eyes had a sort of supplicating look that was piteous beyond words. He was so mild and passive a man in every way that even now I could see there was no anger in him, no danger, no chance of an explosion. The next morning, as soon as we'd finished breakfast, Sir Basil suggested that we take a long walk around the grounds. I told him nothing would give me more pleasure. He took me everywhere, and I saw it all: the topiary, the pools, the fountains, the parterres and the rockeries, and, of course, the sculpture. Most of the contemporary European sculptors were there, in bronze, granite, limestone, and wood. Although it was a pleasure to see them glowing in the sun, to me they looked a trifle out of place in these vast, formal surroundings. "Shall we rest here now for a while?" Sir Basil said, after we'd walked for more than an hour. So we sat down on a white bench beside a water-lily pond and lit cigarettes. We were some way away from the house, on a piece of ground that was raised above its surroundings, and from where we sat the gardens were spread out below. "It must be wonderful in summer." "Oh, it is. You should come down and see it in May and June. Will you promise to do that?" "Of course," I said. "I'd love to come." And as I spoke, I was watching the figure of a woman dressed in red, moving among the flower beds in the far distance. I saw her cross over a wide lawn, and when she was over the lawn, she turned left and went along one side of a high wall of clipped yew, until she came to another smaller lawn that was circular and had in its centre a piece of sculpture. "This garden is younger than the house," Sir Basil said. "It was laid out early in the 18th century by a Frenchman called Beaumont, the same fellow who did Levens in Westmoreland." The woman in the red dress had been joined now by a man, and they were standing face to face, about a yard apart, apparently conversing. The man had some small black object in his hand. They'd turned now towards the piece of sculpture and were pointing at it in a sort of mocking way, apparently laughing and making jokes about its shape. I recognized it as being one of the Henry Moores, done in wood, an object of singular beauty that had 2 or 3 holes in it and a number of strange limbs protruding. The black object in the man's hand turned out to be a camera, and now he had stepped back and was taking pictures of the woman beside the Henry Moore. A great wall of yew hid these two people from the house, and indeed from all of the rest of the garden, except the little hill on which we sat. They had every right to believe they were not overlooked. "You know I love these yews," Sir Basil said. "Have you noticed the different shades of green on the planes and facets of each clipped tree? It's lovely, isn't it?" The woman walked around the back of the wood carving, bent down, and poked her head through one of its holes. The man was photographing her. "There's another thing about yews," Sir Basil said. "In the early summer when the young shoots come out—" At that moment he paused and sat up straighter and leaned slightly forward, and I could sense his whole body suddenly stiffening. The man had taken the photograph, but the woman still had her head through the hole, and now I saw him advance towards her. Then he bent forward so his face was close to hers, touching it, and he held it there while he gave her, I suppose, a few kisses. In the stillness that followed, I fancied I heard a faint far-away tinkle of female laughter coming to us through the sunlight across the garden. "Shall we go back to the house?" I asked. "Back to the house?" "Yes, shall we go back and have a drink before lunch?" "A drink, yes, we'll have a drink." But he didn't move. He sat very still, gone far away from me now, staring intently at the two figures. I noticed now that something queer was happening. The woman still had her head through the hole, but she was beginning to wriggle her body from side to side. The man seemed suddenly uneasy. Then I saw him go forward and begin to manipulate the woman's head with his hands. "She's stuck," Sir Basil said. "I suppose we'd better go down and see if we can help." We came upon them silently, through an archway in the yew hedge, and it was naturally quite a surprise. "What's the matter here?" Sir Basil asked. He spoke softly, but with a dangerous softness that I'm sure his wife had never heard before. "She's gone and put her head through the hole, and now she can't get it out," Major Haddock said. "Just for a lark, you know." "For a what?" "Basil!" Lady Turton shouted. "Do something, can't you?" "Pretty obvious we're going to have to break up this lump of wood," the Major said. "Oh dear," Sir Basil said. "What a terrible pity. My beautiful Henry Moore." At this stage Lady Turton began abusing her husband in a most unpleasant manner, and there's no knowing how long it would have gone on had not Jelks suddenly appeared out of the shadows. "Is there anything I can do, Sir Basil?" He kept his voice level, but I didn't think his face was quite straight. When he looked at Lady Turton there was a little exulting glimmer in his eyes. "Yes, Jelks, there is. Go and get me a saw or something so I can cut out a section of this wood." "Shall I call one of the men, Sir Basil? William is a good carpenter." "No, I'll do it myself. Just get the tools and hurry." While they were waiting for Jelks, I strolled away because I didn't want to hear any more of the things that Lady Turton was saying to her husband, but I was back in time to see the butler returning. He advanced slowly, carrying a saw in one hand, an axe in the other. He held out both implements in front of him so his master could choose, and I saw the hand that was carrying the axe came forward an extra fraction of an inch towards Sir Basil. It was almost exactly like that card trick where the man says, "Take one, whichever one you want, and you always get the one that he means you to have." Sir Basil got the axe. I saw him reach out in a dreamy sort of way, and then the instant he felt the handle in his grasp, he seemed to realize what was required of him, and he sprang to life. For me, after that, it was like the awful moment when you see a child running out into the road and a car is coming, and all you can do is shut your eyes tight and wait until the noise tells you it has happened. I didn't open my eyes again until I heard Sir Basil's voice, even softer than usual, calling in gentle protest to the butler. "Jelks," he was saying, and I saw him standing there as calm as you please, still holding the axe. Lady Turton's head was there too, still sticking through the hole, but her face had turned a terrible ashen grey. "Look here, Jelks," Sir Basil was saying. "What on earth are you thinking about? This thing's much too dangerous. Give me the saw." And as he exchanged implements, I noticed for the first time, round the corners of his eyes, the twinkling tiny wrinkles of a smile.
Nunc-Dimittis, read by Geoffrey Palmer.
It is nearly midnight, and I can see that if I don't make a start with writing this story now, I never shall. My idea, and I believe it was a good one, was to try, by a process of confession and analysis, to discover a reason, or at any rate some justification, for my outrageous behaviour towards Janet de Pelagia. If I'm to be quite honest with myself, I suppose I shall have to admit that what is disturbing me most is the knowledge that I have made a monstrous fool of myself, and that all my friends must now be regarding me as nothing but a vicious, vengeful old man. Yes, that surely hurts. When I say to you that my friends were my whole life, then perhaps you'll begin to understand. Will you? I doubt it, unless I digress for a minute to tell you roughly the sort of person I am. I suppose I am a type. A rare one, mark you, but nevertheless a quite definite type. The wealthy, leisurely, middle-aged man of culture. Adored, I choose the word carefully, by his many friends for his charm, his money, his air of scholarship, his generosity, and I sincerely hope for himself. He is invariably a bachelor, yet he never appears to get entangled with the women who surround him, who love him so dearly. I don't think I need say more. You should know me well enough by now to judge me fairly, and dare I hope it, to sympathize with me when you hear my story. You may even decide that much of the blame for what has happened should be placed not upon me, but upon a lady called Gladys Ponsonby. After all, it was she who started it. Had I not escorted Gladys Ponsonby back to her house that night nearly 6 months ago, and had she not spoken so freely to me about certain people and certain things, then this tragic business could never have taken place. We had been dining with the Ashendons, and when it was time to go, I offered to see her safely back to her house. She accepted, and we left together in my car. But unfortunately, when we arrived at her place, she insisted that I come in and have one for the road. I didn't wish to be stuffy, so I told the chauffeur to wait, and followed her in. Gladys Ponsonby is a widow, a few years younger than me, maybe 53 or 4. And it is possible that 30 years ago she was quite a fetching little thing, but now the face is loose and puckered, with nothing distinctive about it whatsoever. The individual features, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the chin, are buried in the folds of fat around the puckered little face, and one does not notice them, except perhaps the mouth, which reminds me, I cannot help it, of a salmon. In the living room, as she gave me my brandy, I noticed that her hand was a trifle unsteady. The lady is tired, I told myself, so I mustn't stay long. We sat down together on the sofa and for a while discussed the Ashendons' party and the people who were there. Finally, I got up to go. "Lionel, tell me what you think of my new portrait." She indicated a large canvas hanging over the fireplace that I had been trying to avoid with my eye ever since I entered the room. It was a hideous thing. Painted, as I well knew, by a man who was now all the rage in London, a very mediocre painter called John Royden. It was a full-length portrait of Gladys, Lady Ponsonby, painted with a certain technical cunning that made her out to be a quite alluring creature. "Charming," I said. "Listen, Lionel, John Royden is so sought after now that he won't even consider painting anyone for less than 1,000 guineas. "Really?" "Oh, yes, and everyone's queuing up, simply queuing up to get themselves done. Most interesting." She sat silent for a while, sipping her brandy, and I couldn't help noticing how the unsteadiness of her hand was causing the rim of the glass to jog against her lower lip. She knew I was watching her, and without turning her head she swivelled her eyes and glanced at me cautiously. "A penny for your thoughts?" Now, if there is one phrase in the world I cannot abide, it is this. It gives me an actual physical pain in the chest, and I began to cough. "Come on, Lionel, a penny for them." I shook my head, being quite unable to answer. She turned away abruptly and placed the brandy-glass on a small table to her left, and the manner in which she did this seemed to suggest that she felt rebuffed and was now clearing the decks for action. I waited rather uncomfortably in the silence that followed, and because I had no conversation left in me, I made a great play about smoking my cigar, studying the ash intently and blowing the smoke slowly towards the ceiling. There was beginning to be something about this lady that I did not like, a mischievous, brooding air that made me want to get up quickly and go away. When she looked around again, she was smiling at me slyly with those little buried eyes of hers, but the mouth, just like a salmon's, was absolutely rigid. "Lionel, I think I'll tell you a secret. I'm not very good at secrets. I suppose you know that John Royden paints only women?" "I didn't." "And they're always full-length portraits, either standing or sitting, like mine here. Now, take a good look at it, Lionel. Do you see how beautifully the dress is painted?" "Well, go over and look carefully, please." I got up, reluctantly, and went over and examined the painting. To my surprise, I noticed that the paint of the dress was laid on so heavily it was actually raised out from the rest of the picture. It was a trick, quite effective in its way, but neither difficult to do nor entirely original. "You see," she said, "it's thick, isn't it? Where the dress is?" "Yes. But there's a bit more to it than that, you know, Lionel. I think the best way is to describe what happened the very first time I went along for a sitting." "Oh, what a bore this woman is," I thought, "and how can I get away?"
"That was about a year ago. Mr. Royden sat me down, gave me a drink, and came straight to the point. He told me about how he painted quite differently from other artists. In his opinion, he said, there was only one method of attaining perfection when painting a woman's body, and I mustn't be shocked when I heard what it was. You see," he went on, "you examine any painting you like of a woman, I don't care who it's by, and you'll see that although the dress may be well painted, there is an effect of flatness about the whole thing, as though the dress were draped over a log of wood, because the painters themselves didn't really know what was underneath."
Gladys Ponsonby paused to take a few more sips of brandy.
"Don't look so startled, Lionel," she said to me. "There's nothing wrong about this. So then Mr. Royden said, 'That's why I insist on painting my subjects, first of all, in the nude.'" "Good heavens, Mr. Royden!" I exclaimed. "And when I've done you like that," he went on, "we'll have to wait a few weeks for the paint to dry. Then I paint you in your underclothing, and when that's dry, I paint on the dress. You see, it's quite simple."
"The man's an absolute bounder," I cried.
"Oh, don't be silly, Lionel. Anyway, let me finish. The first thing I told him was that my husband, who was alive then, would never agree. "Your husband need never know," he answered. "Why trouble him? No one knows my secret except the woman I've painted." And when I protested a bit more, he said, "My dear Lady Ponsonby, there's nothing immoral about this. Art is only immoral when practised by amateurs. It's the same with medicine. You wouldn't refuse to undress before your doctor, would you?" I told him I would if I'd gone to him for earache. That made him laugh. But he kept on at me about it, and I must say he was very convincing, so after a while I gave in. And that was that. She got up and went over to fetch herself some more brandy. "Gladys, is this really true?" "Of course it's true." "You mean to say that's the way he paints all his subjects?" "Yes. And the joke is the husbands never know anything about it. All they see is a nice, fully clothed portrait of their wives." "Listen, Gladys, I want you to tell me something. Did you by any chance know about this peculiar technique of Royden's before you went to him?" When I asked the question, she was pouring the brandy, and she hesitated, a little silky smile moving the corners of her mouth. "Damn you, Lionel," she said. "You're far too clever. You never let me get away with a thing." "So you knew?" "Of course. Hermione Girdleston told me." "There's still nothing wrong." "Nothing," I said. "Absolutely nothing." I could see it all quite clearly now. This Royden was indeed a bounder, practising as neat a piece of psychological trickery as ever I'd seen. The man knew only too well that there was a whole set of wealthy, indolent women in the city who got up at noon and spent the rest of the day trying to relieve their boredom with bridge and shopping until the cocktail hour came along, while the news of an entertainment like this would spread through their ranks like smallpox. "You won't tell anyone, Lionel, will you?" "No, of course not. But now I must go, Gladys, I really must." "Don't be so silly. I'm just beginning to enjoy myself. Stay till I've finished this drink, anyway." I sat patiently on the sofa while she went on with her interminable brandy-sipping. The little buried eyes were still watching me out of their corners in that mischievous, canny way, and I had a strong feeling that the woman was now hatching out some further unpleasantness or scandal. Then, suddenly, so suddenly that I jumped, she said, "Lionel, what's this I hear about you and Janet de Pelagia?" "Now, Gladys, please." "Lionel, you're blushing." "Nonsense." "Don't tell me the old bachelor has really taken a tumble at last." "Janet is a fine girl." "You can hardly call her a girl." Gladys Ponsonby paused, staring down into the large brandy glass that she held cupped in both hands. "But, of course, I agree with you, Lionel. She's a wonderful person in every way. Except—" and now she spoke very slowly, "except that she does say some rather peculiar things occasionally." "What sort of things?" "Just things, you know. Things about people. About you." "What did she say about me?" "Well, now, let me see. Of course, she was only joking, or I couldn't dream of telling you, but I suppose she did say how it was all a wee bit of a bore." "What was?" "Well, sort of going out to dinner with you nearly every night, that kind of thing." "She said it was a bore?" "Yes." Gladys Ponsonby drained the brandy-glass with one last big gulp, and sitting upright on the sofa began cleverly to mimic the deep tone of that voice I knew so well. "Such a bore, my dear.
Because with Lionel one can always tell exactly what will happen. For dinner we'll go to the Savoy Grill. Always the Savoy Grill. Then in the taxi home he'll start burbling about how he wished he was just 20 years younger. And then at the front door, while I fish for my key, he'll stand beside me with a sort of silly spaniel look in his eyes, and I'll slowly put the key in the lock and slowly turn it, and then, very quickly, before he has time to move, I'll say good night and skip inside and shut the door behind me. Why, Lionel, what's the matter, dear? You look positively ill. At that point, mercifully, I must have swooned clear away. I can remember practically nothing of the rest of that terrible night, except for a vague and disturbing suspicion that when I regained consciousness, I broke down completely and permitted Gladys Ponsonby to comfort me in a variety of different ways. Later, I believe I walked out of the house and was driven home, but I remained more or less unconscious of everything about me until I woke up in my bed the following morning. I can remember with what terrifying swiftness my hatred of Janet de Pelagia began to grow. It all happened in a few minutes, a sudden, violent welling up of hatred. I tried to dismiss it, but it was on me like a fever, and in no time at all I was hunting around as would some filthy gangster for a method of revenge. A curious way to behave, you may say, for a man such as me. To which I would answer, no, not really, if you consider the circumstances. To my mind, this was the sort of thing that could drive a man to murder. As a matter of fact, had it not been for a small sadistic streak that caused me to seek a more subtle and painful punishment for my victim, I might well have become a murderer myself. But mere killing, I decided, was too good for this woman, and far too crude for my taste. So I began looking for a superior alternative. Fury and hate can concentrate a man's mind to an astonishing degree, and in no time at all a plot was forming and unfolding in my head, a plot so superior and exciting that I began to be quite carried away at the idea of it. The next thing I knew, I had the telephone directory in my lap and was searching eagerly for a name. I found it, picked up the phone, and dialed the number. "Hello," I said. "Mr. Royden, Mr. John Royden." Well, it wasn't difficult to persuade the man to call around and see me for a moment. I had never met him, but of course he knew my name, both as an important collector of paintings and as a person of some consequence in society. I was a big fish for him to catch. At the appointed time, he was shown into my library, and I got up to meet him. He was a small, neat man with a slightly ginger goatee beard. He wore a black velvet jacket, a rust-brown tie, a red pullover, and black suede shoes. I shook his small, neat hand. "Mr. Royden," I said, "I have a rather unusual request to make of you, something quite personal in its way." "Yes, Mr. Lamson?" He was sitting in the chair opposite me, and he cocked his head over to one side, quick and perky like a bird. "Of course, I know I can trust you to be discreet about anything I say." "Oh, absolutely, Mr. Lamson." "All right. Now, my proposition is this. There is a certain lady in town here whose portrait I would like you to paint. I very much want to possess a fine painting of her. But there are certain complications. For example, I have my own reasons for not wishing her to know that it is I who am commissioning the portrait. As a man of the world, I'm sure you will understand. Now, do you happen by any chance to know a lady called Janet de Pelagia?" "I've heard of her. I couldn't exactly say I know her." "That's a pity. It makes it a little more difficult. Do you think you could get to meet her, perhaps at a cocktail party or something like that?" "Shouldn't be too tricky, Mr. Lamson." "Good. Because what I suggest is this, that you go up to her and tell her she's the sort of model you've been searching for years. Then ask her if she'd mind sitting for you free of charge. Say you'd like to do a picture of her for next year's Academy. I feel sure she'd be delighted to help you, and honoured, too, if I may say so. Then you will paint her and exhibit the picture and deliver it to me after the show is over. No one but you need know that I have bought it." He seemed to be hesitating, so I said quickly, "I'll be glad to pay you double your usual fee." That did it. The man actually licked his lips. "I should like a full-length portrait, Mr. Royden, please, and I should like her to be standing. That, to my mind, is her most graceful attitude." "I quite understand, Mr. Lampson, and it'll be a pleasure to paint such a lovely lady." "I expect it will," I told myself. "The way you go about it, my boy, I'm quite sure it will." But I said, "All right, Mr. Royden, then I'll leave it all to you." When he had gone, I forced myself to sit still and take 25 deep breaths. I have never in my life felt so exhilarated. My plan was working. The most difficult part was already accomplished. There would be a wait now, a long wait. The way this man painted, it would take him several months to finish the picture. I now decided, on the spur of the moment, that it would be better if I were to go abroad in the interim. And that very next morning, after sending a message to Janet, with whom I was due to dine that night, telling her I had been called away, I left for Italy. There, as always, I had a delightful time, marred only by a constant nervous excitement caused by the thought of returning to the scene of action. I eventually arrived back 4 months later, in July, on the day after the opening of the Royal Academy, and I found to my relief that everything had gone according to plan during my absence. The picture of Janet de Pelagia had been painted and hung in the exhibition, and it was already the subject of much favourable comment both by the critics and the public. When the show was over, Royden delivered the picture to my house and received his money. I immediately had it carried up to my workroom, and with mounting excitement I began to examine it closely. The man had painted her, standing up in a black evening dress, and there was a red plush sofa in the background. Her left hand was resting on the back of a heavy chair, also of red plush, and there was a huge crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. My God, I thought, what a hideous thing! Well, the portrait itself wasn't so bad. He had caught the woman's expression, the forward drop of the head, the wide blue eyes, the large, ugly, beautiful mouth with the trace of a smile in one corner. I bent forward to examine the painting of the dress. Yes, here the paint was thicker, much thicker. At this point, unable to wait another moment, I threw off my coat and prepared to go to work. I should mention here that I am myself an expert cleaner and restorer of paintings. Where my own pictures are concerned, I always do the job myself. I poured out the turpentine and added a few drops of alcohol. I dipped a small wad of cotton wool in the mixture, squeezed it out, and then gently, with a circular motion, I began to work upon the black paint of the dress. For perhaps a whole hour I worked away on this little square of black, proceeding more and more gently as I came closer to the layer below. Then a tiny pink spot appeared, and gradually it spread and spread, until the whole of my square inch was a clear, shining patch of pink. Quickly I neutralized with pure turps. So far, so good. I knew now that the black paint could be removed without disturbing what was underneath. I worked first from the middle of her body downward, and as the lower half of her dress came away bit by bit onto my little wads of cotton wool, a queer pink undergarment began to reveal itself. I didn't for the life of me know what the thing was called, but it was a formidable apparatus constructed of what appeared to be a strong, thick, elastic material, and its purpose was apparently to contain and to compress the woman's bulging figure into a neat, streamlined shape, giving a quite false impression of slimness. Quite fantastic the whole thing seemed to me as I stepped back a pace to survey it. It gave me a strong sense of having somehow been cheated. For had I not, during all these past months, been admiring the sylph-like figure of this lady? She was a faker. No questions about it. But do many other females practice this sort of deception, I wondered? I knew, of course, that in the days of stays and corsets it was usual for ladies to strap themselves up. Yet for some reason I was under the impression that nowadays all they had to do was diet. When the whole of the lower half of the dress had come away, I immediately turned my attention to the upper portion, working my way slowly upward from the lady's middle. Here, around the midriff, there was an area of naked flesh. Then higher, upon the bosom itself, and actually containing it, I came upon a contrivance made of some heavy black material edged with frilly lace. This I knew very well was the brassiere, another formidable appliance upheld by an arrangement of black straps as skilfully and scientifically rigged as the supporting cables of a suspension bridge. Dear me, I thought, one lives and learns. But now, at last, the job was finished, and I stepped back again to take a final look at the picture. It was truly an astonishing sight. This woman, Janet de Pelagia, almost life-size, standing there in her underwear, in a sort of drawing-room, I suppose it was, with a great chandelier above her head and a red plush chair by her side, and she herself. This was the most disturbing part of all, looking so completely unconcerned, with the wide, placid blue eyes, the faintly smiling, ugly, beautiful mouth. Also, I noticed, with something of a shock, that she was exceedingly bow-legged, like a jockey. Now, for the next and final step. Do not imagine, simply because I have not mentioned it lately, that my thirst for revenge had in any way diminished during the last few months. On the contrary. And with the last act about to be performed, I found it hard to contain myself. That night, for example, I didn't even go to bed. You see, I couldn't wait to get the invitations out. I sat up all night preparing them and addressing the envelopes. There were 22 of them in all, and I wanted each to be a personal note. The first, the most carefully phrased, was to Janet de Pelagia. In it, I regretted not having seen her for so long. I had been abroad. It was time we got together again, etc., etc. The next was to Gladys Ponsonby, then one to Lady Hermione Girdlestone, another to Princess Bicano. It was a carefully selected list, containing, as it did, the most distinguished men, the most brilliant and influential women in the top crust of our society. At 8:30, on the evening of the 22nd, my large drawing-room was filled with people. They stood about the room, admiring the pictures, drinking their martinis, talking with loud voices. Janet de Pelagia was wearing the same black dress she had used for the portrait, and every time I caught sight of her, a kind of huge bubble vision, as in those absurd cartoons, would float up above my head, and in it I would see Janet in her underclothes, the black brassiere, the pink elastic belt, the jockey's legs. Dinner was announced, and we all moved out. "My goodness!" they cried as they entered the dining-room. "How dark and sinister! What divine candles! Lionel, how romantic!" There were 6 very thin candles set about 2 feet apart from each other down the centre of the long table. Their small flames made a little glow of light around the table itself, but left the rest of the room in darkness. It was an amusing arrangement, and apart from the fact that it suited my purpose well, it made a pleasant change. The guests soon settled themselves in their right places, and the meal began. For my part, I was watching the candles. They were so thin that I knew it would not be long before they burnt down to their bases. Also, I was mighty nervous, I will admit that, but at the same time intensely exhilarated, almost to the point of drunkenness. They were eating their strawberries when at last I decided the time had come.
I took a deep breath, and in a loud voice I said, "I'm afraid we'll have to have the lights on now. The candles are nearly finished. Mary!" I called. "Oh, Mary, switch on the lights, will you please?" There was a moment of silence after my announcement. I heard the maid walking over to the door, then the gentle click of the switch, and the room was flooded with a blaze of light. They all screwed up their eyes, opened them again, gazed about them. At that point, I got up from my chair and slid quietly from the room. But as I went, I saw a sight that I shall never forget as long as I live. It was Janet, with both hands in mid-air, stopped, frozen, rigid, caught in the act of gesticulating towards someone across the table. Her mouth had dropped open 2 inches, and she wore the surprised, not quite understanding look of a person who precisely 1 second before has been shot dead right through the heart. In the hall outside, I paused and listened to the beginning of the uproar, the shrill cries of the ladies and the outraged, unbelieving exclamations of the men. Then, and this was the sweetest moment of all, I heard Lord Mulherin's voice, roaring above the rest, "Here, someone! Hurry! Give us some water, quick!" Out in the street, the chauffeur helped me into my car, and soon we were away from London and bowling merrily along the Great North Road towards this, my other house, which is only 95 miles from town anyway. The next 2 days I spent in gloating. I mooned around in a dream of ecstasy. It wasn't until this morning, when Gladys Ponsonby called me on the phone, that I suddenly came to my senses and realized I was not a hero at all, but an outcast. She informed me, with what I thought was just a trace of relish, that all my old and loving friends had sworn never, never to speak to me again. Except her, she kept saying. And didn't I think it would be rather cosy if she were to come down and stay with me a few days to cheer me up? I'm afraid I was too upset by that time even to answer her politely. I put the phone down and went away to weep. Then at noon today came the final crushing blow. The post arrived, and with it— I can hardly bring myself to write about it, I'm so ashamed— came a letter, the sweetest, most tender little note imaginable, from none other than Janet de Pelagia herself. She forgave me completely, she wrote. She knew it was only a joke, and I must not listen to the horrid things other people were saying about me. Oh, what a cad, what a brute I felt when I read this. The more so when I found that she had actually sent me by the same post a small present as an added sign of her affection, a half-pound jar of my favourite food of all, fresh caviar. I can never, under any circumstances, resist good caviar. It is perhaps my greatest weakness. So, although I naturally had no appetite whatsoever for food at dinner-time this evening, I must confess I took a few spoonfuls of the stuff in an effort to console myself in my misery. It is even possible that I took a shade too much, because I haven't been feeling any too chipper this last hour or so. Perhaps I ought to go up right away and get myself some bicarbonate of soda. I can easily come back and finish this later, when I'm in better trim. You know, now I come to think of it, I really do feel rather ill all of a sudden.